The morning sun hit the Henderson house like a spotlight, catching every imperfection in Marcus Webb's meticulously maintained driveway. He was meticulous about everything. The house he'd bought at 43 after his divorce, the garden he'd rebuilt with his own hands, and especially the pool he'd installed last summer. It wasn't just a luxury. It was his peace. Marcus stood at the edge of the pool gate, coffee in hand, watching the water shimmer. The gate was old, ornate wrought iron that had come with the house, but it worked. It locked, it kept people out, and his liability contained. He'd had it inspected twice. The hinges were solid, the latch was secure. He didn't expect to need any of it when Karen Pritchard moved into the corner lot 2 weeks ago. He'd seen the moving trucks, waved politely when she'd waddled across his lawn in designer sandals that cost more than his first car payment. Karen had smiled that smile, the one that suggested she was doing Marcus a favor by existing in his neighborhood. She was the type of woman who looked like she'd been constructed by a focus group, honey blonde highlights, a face that had definitely been adjusted by someone with good insurance, and clothes that announced themselves before she did. "Hi there, neighbor," she'd called out, her voice pitched at a frequency that made dogs nervous. "I love what you've done with the place, so quaint." Marcus had smiled back. He'd been divorced long enough to know that every interaction with women like Karen would end badly, so why not be civil? "Thanks, welcome to the neighborhood." That was 2 weeks ago. Today, he discovered her car parked directly in front of his pool gate. Not next to his driveway, not across from it, directly across the gate, parallel to the street, with the BMW's massive frame creating an absolute barricade. It was a pearl-white M340i, new enough to smell like corporate success and poor financial decisions. Marcus set down his coffee on the patio table and walked to the gate, trying to think of reasonable explanations. Maybe she hadn't realized. Maybe she was running in to grab something. But even as he thought it, he could see through his kitchen window. Her Range Rover was in her driveway, perfectly parked. The BMW was a second vehicle, positioned with what felt like intention. He walked across his lawn and knocked on her door. Karen answered in cream-colored loungewear that probably had a thread count higher than most people's actual thoughts. Behind her, Marcus could see an interior decorated by someone who'd bought the entire showroom. "Marcus, hi, honey," she stretched the word into 3 syllables. "What can I do for you?" "Your car," he said, keeping his voice level. "It's parked across my pool gate." Karen's smile didn't waver. "Is it?" "Yes, I need to be able to access the pool area, for maintenance." "Oh," she waved a hand like he'd mentioned, checking the mailbox. "Well, the street is public. I can park wherever I want." She paused, tilting her head with what she probably thought was charm. "Unless there's a specific reason." There was. The city had codes about pool access. But more than that, more than any practical reason, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. The casual dismissal. The assumption that her presence mattered more than his needs. That his property, his peace, his clearly stated concern meant nothing against her right to do whatever she wanted. "It would be helpful if you didn't," he said quietly. "I'll think about it," Karen replied, already closing the door. "But no promises, sweetie." That night, Marcus lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. He wasn't angry, exactly. Anger required emotional investment. He was something cooler than that. He was disappointed in humanity. The world was full of Karens, women who'd never been told no, who'd never experienced a consequence that didn't eventually dissolve into a tear-stained apology they didn't mean. He got up and went to his home office, pulling up the city code on his computer. Pool safety regulations, driveway access, municipal ordinances about blocking private property for more than, he checked. It didn't specify, but there were other codes, harassment codes, intentional obstruction. Marcus closed the laptop. He wasn't that person. He didn't file reports. He didn't escalate things. He resolved things. The next morning, the BMW was still there. Marcus left a note, professional and friendly, taped to her windshield. "Hi, Karen, the city has specific regulations about pool gate access for safety and maintenance. I'd appreciate if you could move your vehicle. Thanks, Marcus." She didn't move it. By Friday, he'd left 3 notes. The 4th time, she'd responded with a note of her own. "Stop touching my car. This is harassment. K." Marcus felt something cold slide down his spine at that. Harassment. He touched a piece of paper he'd taped to her window. The audacity of weaponizing that word, of inverting the actual situation into something where he was the problem, it cracked something in him. A small crack, but a crack nonetheless. That Friday, she had a party. Marcus heard it starting around 9 p.m., music thumping through her open garage, the kind of bass that made his fence rattle. He looked out his bedroom window and saw her driveway full of cars, her yard full of people holding drinks, her illuminated face tilted back, laughing with her friends. And the BMW, still parked across his pool gate. He went back to bed and put in earbuds, trying to drown it out. But he lay awake, aware of every bass drop, every shrieking laugh that cut through the music. Around 1 a.m., a couple stumbled into her yard, practically having sex against her oak tree. Around 2 a.m., someone threw up in her landscaping. Around 3 a.m., the noise finally stopped. By morning, the BMW had been moved exactly 4 feet. Now it blocked half the gate instead of all of it. Marcus made coffee and sat on his patio. The morning light was perfect. The air was cool. The water in his pool was exactly the temperature he'd set it. And across from him, the universe was offering him a choice. He could handle this like an adult. Call a lawyer, file a report, engage the system. It would be slow, it would be expensive, it would be uncertain. Or he could handle it like someone who understood that some people only responded to consequences. Marcus thought about her note, her tone, the way she'd looked through him when she closed her door like he was already irrelevant. He thought about the assumption that nothing he said mattered because she'd never been taught that it did. He picked up his phone and called a locksmith. "I need to have my pool gate evaluated," he told the man who showed up 3 hours later. "I'm concerned about the access mechanism." The locksmith, a guy named Dave with 30 years of experience, examined the gate thoroughly. The latch was solid. The hinges were perfect. But when Marcus explained the issue, someone repeatedly blocking access, Dave nodded like he'd seen this before. "Gate's old," Dave said, running his hand along the mechanism. "You could upgrade the latch mechanism, make it more robust, something that requires a specific key. Limit access to authorized personnel only." Marcus listened as Dave explained the options. A new digital system, a reinforced lock, options for emergency override, security measures, everything legitimate and sound. "Or," Dave said, standing back and studying the gate with a professional eye, "you could just leave it as is. It's actually built pretty solid, not like it's going anywhere. Sometimes the question isn't whether something's secure, it's whether it's secure enough for what's behind it." Marcus understood the subtext. The gate was fine. The gate was always fine. The question was whether it was strong enough to contain what he wanted contained. "I think I'll upgrade the latch," Marcus said. "And I want to document that the pool area is now restricted access only, for liability." Dave nodded and didn't ask questions. Friday night, Karen hosted another party. This time, Marcus heard the laughter, heard the splash as someone jumped in his pool, someone from her party trespassing in his water. He watched from his bedroom window as drunk people moved through the shadows of his yard, silhouettes of violation. He didn't sleep. He sat on his back patio in the darkness and watched them. Watched the girl in the red dress wobble toward his pool gate, watched a man in a polo shirt point his flashlight around like the space was public property. Watched Karen herself appear on his lawn in a silver cocktail dress, taking a photo of his pool, probably for Instagram. At 2 a.m., they left. He waited until every car had cleared, until the last of them had wobbled down the street. Then he got up and did something he'd been thinking about all day. The pool gate had a lock now. A good one. Digital, secure, documented. But that wasn't what Marcus was thinking about as he stood in the darkness. He was thinking about the hydraulic mechanism that controlled the gate opening, the pneumatic arm that had been installed decades ago, probably when the gate was new. It was positioned to close the gate smoothly, gently, designed for a time when pools were quiet spaces and nobody needed to understand force. But force was relative, wasn't it? He'd read about it in the manual that had come with the pool. The mechanism had a maximum load capacity. It could handle the gate itself, could handle wind, could handle a person leaning on it. But what about a car? Marcus stood in his garage in the darkness and looked at his toolbox. He didn't do anything that night. He just looked. He thought about Karen's perfectly painted face. He thought about the way she'd waved her hand, dismissing him. He thought about the assumption that she could do whatever she wanted because she was used to doing whatever she wanted. He thought about consequences. When morning came, he hadn't touched anything. He'd simply made a decision. The pool gate, with its new locks and documented restrictions, would remain as is. his property, his rules, his water. And if someone consistently, deliberately, arrogantly blocking his access, if that someone ever tried to move their car herself by opening the gate without proper authorization, well, the gate would be closed, the gate would be secure, the gate would function exactly as designed. And if her car was parked against it when she did something foolish, that would be a consequence, not something he'd done, something she'd done. The gate would simply be secure. Marcus walked to his bedroom and lay down. For the first time all week, he slept deeply. Monday morning, the BMW was back, parked perfectly across the gate. And this time, there was a note stuck to Marcus's front door. The noise from your pool parties is disturbing my peace. If you're going to use that thing on weekends, keep the screaming to a reasonable level. I shouldn't have to hear your guests at midnight. And tell your friends to respect other people's property. Karen. There had been no pool parties. His guests were his ex-wife's brother from out of town, who he'd allowed to sit quietly by the water for one evening with a beer. There had been no screaming. Marcus read the note 3 times. Each time the internal temperature dropped, not hot, cold, the kind of cold that came with clarity. She was going to keep pushing. She was going to keep inverting everything, making herself the victim, making him the problem. And nothing he did, no notes, no civility, no reasonable requests, would change that because she didn't respect the boundary. She didn't respect him. She'd never been taught that she had to. That afternoon, Marcus called a contractor. Not Dave, someone else. He told them he wanted to reinforce his pool gate. Specifically, he wanted to upgrade the mechanism to handle additional load. Not because the gate needed it, but because he wanted it documented that he was being cautious, responsible, proactive. What kind of load? The contractor asked. I'd rather not say, Marcus replied. But I want it robust. I want it to be strong enough to hold against significant pressure without failing. The contractor was silent for a moment. Then, you know that's going to make it less forgiving, right? If something pushes against it and the mechanism gives, it's going to give all at once. Complete failure, not gradual. That's the point, Marcus said quietly. Wednesday evening, Karen came to his door. She was holding a wine glass in one hand and wearing that smile, the one that meant she'd decided he could be charmed. Marcus, honey, I think we got off on the wrong foot, she said, tilting the wine toward him like it was evidence of her sophistication. I know the car situation has been frustrating, but here's the thing. A driveway is too small for both cars, and honestly, parking on the street is just more convenient. Plus, I need to leave myself the option to take off quickly sometimes, for emergencies. Move your car, Marcus said, not unkindly, just directly. Look, I'm trying to be reasonable. So am I. Move your car. Karen's expression hardened, just a flicker, but it was there. The moment the mask slipped and something uglier showed through. You know what? No, I'm going to park wherever I want, and if you have a problem with it, you can call the police. But we both know that's not going to. Marcus closed the door. He stood on the other side of it and listened as she stood on his porch for another 10 seconds, waiting for him to open it again, to continue the conversation, to give her the attention and engagement she was owed. When he didn't, he heard her take a sharp breath, then her footsteps, angry now, stomping away. That night, Marcus pulled up the weather forecast. Saturday looked perfect, sunny, hot. The kind of day when someone might wash their car or work in their yard or, if they were foolish, try to move a car that was illegally parked against a pool gate. The contractors finished their work Friday afternoon. They tested the mechanism 3 times. It was stronger than before, much stronger. The gate would close with authority now. The kind of authority that suggested it would not appreciate obstacles. Marcus signed off on the work and paid them in cash, something he never did. They didn't ask questions. Saturday morning arrived perfect and blue. Marcus woke early and made coffee, watching the street through his kitchen window. Karen's car sat there, brazen in the morning light, still blocking access, still claiming space that wasn't hers. He waited. Around 10 a.m., Karen emerged from her house in a white bikini cover-up, sunglasses on, looking like a woman who decided to spend the day by her pool. He watched her stand on her driveway, looking at her 2 cars, one perfectly parked, one deliberately positioned, and make what seemed like a decision. She was going to move the BMW. Marcus watched her go back inside, probably getting her keys. He was standing by his pool gate when she emerged again, keys in hand, confidence radiating from her like she'd never experienced a consequence in her life. She walked toward the car, phone in her other hand, texting something. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't acknowledge him at all. To her, he was the neighbor who'd become irrelevant, the one who couldn't stop her, couldn't make her do anything. She clicked the remote. The car unlocked. She opened the driver's side door and slid behind the wheel. Marcus stood by his gate and waited. The engine started. He heard the distinctive luxury purr of the BMW's expensive motor. She was going to pull forward, he thought. She was going to move the car, and that would be that. The whole thing would be resolved. He could go back to his life, his pool, his peace. But that wasn't how it worked with people like Corinne. They never learned until they had to. They never changed unless forced. And if he let her move the car now, she'd just park it there again next week. So he didn't move. He stood by his pool gate in the way, blocking her exit. Corinne saw him and waved irritably, gesturing for him to move. He didn't. She honked. He stood still. He watched her face shift from annoyance to confusion to anger. She put the car in park and opened the door, ready to tell him off. "Move your car," Marcus called to her, his voice carrying across the space between them. "Or I'm calling the police for illegal parking." "You're standing in my way." She pointed at him like he was the unreasonable one. "Move the car." She stared at him, and he could see the exact moment when she realized he wasn't going to back down, that her normal methods wouldn't work here, that he'd changed, that he was willing to make this worse, not better. She flipped him off, got back in the car, and, with a roar of expensive engine, started to pull forward, aiming to navigate around his property somehow, to prove she didn't need to move it out of the way, that she could just. The pool gate, newly reinforced, was right there. She saw it at the last second. Her eyes widened, she hit the brakes. But the BMW's front bumper had already made contact. It was nothing, a bump really, a minor kiss against the wrought iron. The gate didn't budge. Corinne tried again. A little more gas. A bit more force. The BMW's powerful engine engaged, and she was trying to push the gate open, trying to force her way past it instead of simply revering and accepting that sometimes you had to inconvenience yourself. The gate was reinforced now. The mechanisms were upgraded. The hydraulics were calibrated for strength, not gentleness. What happened next, Marcus had technically predicted. But seeing it happen, actually watching the math of force meet the reality of structure, it was different than imagining it. The gate didn't open. Instead, in a movement that seemed almost graceful, the gate held firm, and Corinne, still pressing forward, felt the car nudged slightly to the left by the immovable object. She cranked the wheel, trying to angle around it. There was a scraping sound, metal on metal. Then she realized her car wasn't going anywhere. The gate was blocking her, and the only way forward was through, and through was not a choice the gate was offering. Marcus heard her panic, actually heard it in the pitch of her voice as she realized what was happening. She put the car in reverse, too hard, and the tires squealed. She was out now, she was backing up, she was. "Corinne," Marcus called out. She looked at him, and there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where her eyes met his and she understood. She understood that he'd done this, that he'd known, that he'd let her walk into it. "Turn the wheel," he shouted, actually helpful now, actually trying to help her avoid what was about to happen. She spun the wheel, hard. The car swerved as she backed up faster, pulling away from the gate with jerky, panicked movements, not looking behind her, not checking her. The pool gate was still open. From this morning when he'd opened it to test the mechanism. And the pool, perfectly blue, perfectly maintained, perfectly deep, was exactly where her car was backing toward. He watched her realize it. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth opened. She must have thrown it in park, must have tried to stop the momentum, but she was already moving, already angled wrong already. The rear of the BMW crossed the pool edge. For a moment it teetered. Marcus stood frozen, watching his new neighbor sit in her car as it balanced on the edge of his property, tipping between earth and water. He could see her hands gripping the wheel. He could see her mouth moving, probably screaming, probably praying, probably understanding for the first time in her life that consequences were real. Then physics made its statement. The car's weight found the water. The rear wheels slipped. And the BMW, all 3,500 pounds of pure financial waste, slid backward into Marcus Webb's pool with a sound like destiny. The splash was enormous. Water erupted across the patio. The car tilted, nose up, as the water rushed in. And then it was sinking, actually sinking, into his chlorinated water, the pearl-white paint disappearing beneath the surface like a ghost learning to let go. Karen screamed. She was scrambling out of the car, half falling out of the driver's side door as the interior filled with water. She hit the pool deck gasping, drenched, her white cover-up plastered to her skin, her perfect hair destroyed. She was alive, she was fine. She was crying and gasping and alive. Marcus stood there, his reinforced gate still upright, his pool still deep, his property still his. The BMW was gone now, a shadow beneath the surface, a $300,000 consequence of bad choices. Karen looked at him, sitting on his pool deck, soaking and sobbing, and he saw something break in her. Not her body, her certainty. The absolute unshakable confidence that the world would always bend to her will. "Did you," she gasped, "did you know, did you do that on purpose?" Marcus didn't answer. He just turned and walked back into his house, leaving her there on his pool deck, surrounded by the water she'd pushed him to contain, sitting with the consequences she'd created. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at his kitchen table, looking at the small crack that was forming in him. Not a fissure, not yet, just a fracture line. Her car was in his pool. He'd indirectly, technically not directly, caused that to happen, and he didn't feel the triumph he'd expected. He felt something else entirely. Marcus had already called them himself, reporting that his neighbor's vehicle had accidentally entered his pool. He'd given them the straightforward account. She'd been trying to back up to avoid hitting the gate, hadn't checked behind her, and the vehicle had slipped into the water. He'd emphasized that she appeared to be physically unharmed. Officer Dolores Martinez was a woman in her 50s who'd seen enough of this neighborhood's drama to remain unimpressed by most things. She stood with her hands on her belt and looked at Karen, still wrapped in one of Marcus's towels, shaking on his patio. "So you were moving your car," Officer Martinez said, consulting her notebook. "He told me to," Karen said, pointing at Marcus with a shaking finger. "He was standing in the way and I was trying to back up and he set it up. He wanted this to happen." "Set what up, ma'am?" "The gate," Karen gestured wildly at the reinforced gate, which looked exactly like a gate. "He reinforced it. He made it strong on purpose so my car would bounce back toward the pool. He did this." Officer Martinez looked at Marcus, then back at Karen. "The gate stopped your car from leaving." "Yes." "And you were backing up fast?" Yes, I was backing away from it." "So you were revering without looking behind you and your vehicle went into the pool." Officer Martinez wrote something down. "That's backing up without adequate visibility. Standard accident, unfortunate circumstances." "No, he knew." "Did your neighbor inform you to back toward the pool?" "No, but..." "Did he tell you to put the car in reverse?" "He told me to move the car." "And you did. He didn't specify the method, I assume." Karen closed her mouth. Officer Martinez's expression was that particular flavor of law enforcement sympathy reserved for people who'd created their own disasters. "The insurance company will investigate," the officer said. "They'll look at the gate specs, the pool design, any modifications. If your neighbor did something intentional to cause property damage, they'll find it. Until then, this is your accident." "He was standing there." "Was he physically in your way while you were backing up?" "No, he moved." "Then he didn't prevent your vehicle from going in any direction you chose. He just requested you move the car off his driveway access." Officer Martinez closed her notebook. "Which, for the record, is his property, and blocking it is a courtesy issue at minimum." The fire department arrived to begin the process of extracting the BMW from the pool. A tow truck, a diver to inspect for hazards, equipment and professionals, and the cold machinery of consequence descending on Karen's day. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as she sat on her porch, still wrapped in his towel, her phone pressed to her ear. He could see her mouth moving, probably calling someone, her lawyer, her insurance agent, her husband maybe. He suddenly realized he didn't know if she was married, didn't know anything about her beyond the surface. It didn't matter. The BMW emerged from the pool looking violated. Water streamed from its windows. The leather interior was ruined. The electronics completely destroyed. It hung from the tow cable like something that had been drowned and was now being displayed as proof of the drowning. The insurance adjuster arrived at 2 p.m. A woman named Sheila with a digital camera and a clipboard. She took photos. She examined the gate. She looked at the pool design. She asked Marcus detailed questions about the reinforcement. "When was this work done?" she asked, consulting her notes. "Friday," Marcus said. "I have the contractor's invoice if you need it." "And why the upgrade?" "Safety," Marcus said. "I wanted the gate to be more secure, more substantial. The city has liability codes for pool properties. I wanted to exceed minimum requirements." Sheila nodded and made a note. "And you had no anticipation of how this reinforcement might affect a vehicle's interaction with the gate?" "No," Marcus said, and it was technically true. He hadn't anticipated, he'd predicted. There was a legal difference, probably. "We'll need to review the specifications with our engineers," Sheila said. "But from what I'm seeing, the gate did exactly what a secure gate is supposed to do. It prevented access. Your neighbor made a decision to reverse her vehicle without adequate visibility. That's a driver error, not a design defect." Marcus nodded and said nothing. By 5 p.m., the BMW was gone. The pool was being drained, cleaned, refilled, a process that would take until morning. Karen had disappeared into her house. The party atmosphere of the disaster had evaporated, leaving only the wreckage of choices. Marcus sat on his patio and watched the water drain. He'd spent all day watching, and now that it was evening, he felt the exhaustion of the watching, the constant presence of himself in the moment, the awareness of his own agency. He'd reinforced that gate knowing, not consciously, not with explicit intent, but with enough knowledge to justify the reinforcement. He'd stood in her way as a test. He'd essentially dared her to push forward, and she had, because people like Karen didn't understand the concept of backing down. But she was learning now, and the cost of her education had been considerable. His phone rang at 7 p.m. His ex-wife calling because she'd somehow heard about the incident already. The neighborhood had apparently exploded in a group text thread about Karen's car in Marcus's pool. "What exactly happened?" Susan asked, her voice carrying the particular stress of someone who'd divorced Marcus specifically because he was reactive and complicated. "She was parked across my pool gate," Marcus said. "She was trying to move the car, she backed up without looking, and it went in the pool." "Did you do something to make that happen?" "No." "Did you somehow engineer it?" "No, Susan." A pause, he could hear her thinking, "But you knew somehow that it could happen." "I reinforced my gate." "Why would you?" Susan cut herself off. "Are you having a breakdown?" "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've never been fine with confrontation. You internalize it and then do something weird. This is weird. This is you doing something weird." "I upgraded my gate for safety purposes. My neighbor illegally parked across my driveway access. She hit the gate while backing up and her car went in my pool. That's what happened." "And you're okay with that?" Marcus looked out at the pool, at the water that was slowly being replaced. "No," he said quietly, "not really." The insurance investigation took 3 weeks. The engineers looked at the gate specifications, at the pool design, at the trajectory of the vehicle. They interviewed both Karen and Marcus. They looked at the timeline of the reinforcement work. In the end, they determined that the gate had functioned as designed, that the reinforcement did not constitute a safety defect, that Karen's vehicle had entered the pool due to operator error, specifically, reveering without adequate visibility. Insurance would cover the damages, but only because Karen had comprehensive coverage. The claim would raise her rates, a lot. Marcus got a letter from Karen's lawyer. It alleged that he'd intentionally created a dangerous condition, that he'd known his reinforced gate could cause damage, that he'd deliberately placed himself in her path to provoke a reaction. Marcus's own lawyer, he'd hired one immediately after seeing the letter, advised him that it was a bluff. There was no evidence of intentional harm. The gate was on his property. The pool was on his property. Karen had been operating a vehicle on her own property that she'd lost control of. "However," his lawyer said, a practical man named Frank who'd handled the divorce, "this is going to cost her money to pursue, and she knows it. It's likely just a negotiation tactic." "What would she negotiate for?" Marcus asked. "An apology, usually. Admission of fault, sometimes money. Usually she just wants to feel like she won something." Marcus stared at him. "She drowned her car because she ignored my requests to move it and then drove recklessly." "Yes," Frank said, "but in her mind, you set a trap. And legally, the argument is that you had a responsibility to warn her about your gate modifications. I had no responsibility to do that. Correct, which is why her suit will fail. But she can still file it, still cost you money defending it, still make your life uncomfortable. That's leverage. Marcus fired Frank. He didn't hire another lawyer. If Karen wanted to sue him, she could. He had time. 2 months after the car incident, Marcus noticed something. Karen had stopped going out. He'd see her car, a temporary replacement, a sensible Lexus, in her driveway, but she didn't appear to be actually using it much. She didn't host parties. She didn't wave at neighbors. When he saw her getting the mail, she wore sunglasses even on cloudy days. The neighborhood had turned on her, he realized. Not overtly, but in the way neighborhoods could turn. The story, as told across driveways and in group chats, had become simplified. Karen had illegally parked, got in her neighbor's way, and lost her expensive car in his pool because of her own stupidity. She was the villain in the narrative. He was the pragmatic man who'd set boundaries. Nobody needed to know about the reinforced gate. Nobody needed to know about his predictive knowledge. The story was simpler. She deserved what she got. Marcus should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt something hollowing out inside him. It was a Thursday morning in the 3rd month when he saw Karen sitting on her porch, looking at his pool. The gate was back in place. The pool was in perfect condition. Everything had returned to a semblance of normalcy, except for the absence of the BMW and the presence of something darker. She looked at him when he came outside, and for the first time since the incident, she made eye contact. Her face was different, thinner, exhausted, aged by something more than time. "I'm leaving," she said. Her voice was small, smaller than he'd ever heard it. Marcus didn't say anything. "I'm selling the house. My husband is. We're separating. The insurance situation, the financial impact, the way people look at me now," she trailed off. "I'm just leaving." Still, Marcus said nothing. "Did you mean for it to happen?" she asked. "Please, I just want to know." He could have lied. He could have said no, it was an accident, she was unlucky. He could have taken the narrative victory and let her go believing he was innocent. Instead, he told her the truth. "I wanted you to learn that actions have consequences. I didn't predict exactly how you'd learn it, but I knew you wouldn't learn it any other way." Karen looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded like that confirmed something she'd suspected. She went back inside. The house sold within a month to a family with young children and a dog. They seemed nice. They waved in the morning. The wife asked him for pool cleaning recommendations. Life continued. The crack inside Marcus widened. 6 months after Karen left, Marcus was having coffee at Rosselli's, the neighborhood cafe where people gossiped and pretended they weren't gossiping. He wasn't there to participate in the gossip. He was there because their espresso was good and their pastries were excellent. But he couldn't help hearing the conversations around him. "Did you know Karen ended up moving to Sacramento?" A woman with blonde highlights, not Karen, was telling her friend. "And apparently her husband filed for divorce. The whole insurance thing cost them like $40,000 even after the claim." "She always seemed like she was asking for trouble," the friend said. Marcus stirred his coffee and tried not to exist in this conversation he was nonetheless hearing. "I heard he did it on purpose," the blonde woman continued. "Reinforced the gate specifically so her car would get pushed into the pool." "That's dark." "Right, but honestly, she was parked illegally for months. Some people deserve what they get." Marcus left money on the table and walked out. The phrase followed him. Some people deserve what they get. It was the kind of casual cruelty that society accepted because it affirmed people's belief in the universe's fairness. The world was just. Bad behavior was punished. Everyone got what they deserved. But the world wasn't just, and Marcus knew it. He'd created his own justice. He decided Karen was the problem and had constructed a solution. And the solution had worked perfectly, which meant he'd done something right, which meant the crack inside him should have closed. Instead, it widened. Marcus began running in the mornings. Long distances, pushing himself to exhaustion, trying to outrun the sense that something was fundamentally wrong with what he'd done. He'd hurt someone. Not with his hands, not directly, but through calculation and patience. He'd weaponized circumstance. His therapist, whom he'd started seeing after the divorce was finalized, noticed the change when Marcus returned to his sessions after nearly a year away. Dr. Patricia Chen was a woman in her 60s who'd stopped being impressed by people's narratives and started being interested in the truths underneath them. "You look like someone who's done something and can't undo it," she said, which was an excellent opening. Marcus told her about Karen, not the embellished version, the full version. The notes, the deliberate provocation, the reinforced gait, the prediction of her panic, the knowledge he'd acted on. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set down her pen. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Because she wasn't listening." "To what?" "My requests, my boundaries, my reasonable needs." "And you'd tried other methods." "I'd asked, I'd been civil, I'd left notes." "And she'd ignored all of it." "Yes." "So you escalated." "Yes." Dr. Chen leaned back in her chair. "Do you think you were justified?" Marcus wanted to say yes. He constructed the justification in his head. She was harassing him, blocking his property, dismissing his concerns. She was the aggressor. She created the situation that led to her own consequences. But that wasn't what his body believed. His body felt like he'd done something unforgivable. "I think I was understandable," he said carefully. "I'm not sure I was justified." "What's the difference?" "Understandable means, given the circumstances, I can explain why I did it. Justified means I had the right to do it." "And you didn't have the right." Marcus thought about Karen on her porch, aged by months of social rejection. He thought about her telling him she was leaving. He thought about her husband filing for divorce. He thought about the ripples of consequence spreading further than just her car. "I had a legal right," he said. "I had a right to reinforce my own gate. I had a right to stand on my own property. I didn't have the right to predict how she'd react and let her walk into that prediction anyway." Dr. Chen picked up her pen again. "So what you're describing is premeditated harm dressed up in the language of boundaries." "I didn't physically harm her." "You calculated her panic and allowed it to happen. You withheld information you had about what would happen if she tried what you predicted she'd try. You essentially baited a trap and waited for her to step in it." "She deserved." "Did she?" The question hung in the air. Marcus realized he didn't know anymore. She'd been annoying. She'd been dismissive. She'd violated his boundaries repeatedly. Had she deserved to lose her car? Had she deserved her marriage to fall apart? Had she deserved to be socially exiled from her neighborhood? "I don't know," he said quietly. "That's the beginning of understanding," Dr. Chen said. "So what are you going to do about it?" Marcus spent the next 3 weeks researching Karen Pritchard. It was surprisingly easy. She had social media, profiles, a trail of information across the internet. He found her new address in Sacramento. He found articles about her business. She'd owned an interior design firm that had apparently closed. He found her maiden name and learned that her mother had passed away 2 years before she moved to his neighborhood. He learned that she was going through a public divorce in which her ex-husband was contesting her claims about financial infidelity, which she'd alleged happened as a result of stress from the insurance situation. He learned that her therapist, there was a Yelp review she'd left, carefully anonymous but clearly her, describing anxiety and depression, was located in Midtown Sacramento. He learned that her father had passed away before the divorce, before she moved, before any of it. That she'd been alone with her grief, wearing designer clothes and performing the confidence of someone who'd never been hurt. Marcus sat with this knowledge for a long time. It didn't forgive him. Nothing could do that. But it contextualized her behavior. She hadn't been a villain. She'd been a person doing her best to seem fine while everything inside her was breaking. And he'd pushed her. He picked up his phone and called a florist. He sent flowers to Karen's address in Sacramento with a card that simply said, "I'm sorry, Marcus Webb." He didn't expect a response. He didn't think it would fix anything. But he also couldn't not do it because the crack inside him was becoming a chasm, and he could either accept himself as someone capable of calculated cruelty, or he could do the one thing that might allow him to sleep. The florist confirmed delivery 2 days later. Marcus waited for a response that never came. A month after sending the flowers, Marcus was at Rossella's again, and the blonde woman from before was at the next table over. "Did you hear Karen's back?" she was telling her companion. "Just briefly to close out the house sale. Apparently she's moving to Portland now, starting over." "Again?" her friend asked. "Well, Sacramento didn't work out, Something about the divorce getting messy and she wanted a fresh start. Totally different state. Marcus heard this and felt the full weight of what he'd done. Karen wasn't learning. She wasn't growing. She was running. She was a woman in motion, unable to stop, unable to put down roots, forever chased by the consequences of a moment when she decided to ignore her neighbor's requests. And it was his fault. He left the cafe and drove to his pool. The water was perfect. The gate was strong. Everything was exactly as he wanted it. But the perfection was hollow. It had been purchased with someone else's suffering. That evening, Marcus made a decision. He called his lawyer, a different lawyer this time, one who specialized in litigation. He told him he wanted to pay Karen's insurance settlement, all of it. He would cover the $40,000 his reinforced gate had cost her family. "Why would you do that?" his lawyer asked, genuinely confused. "Because she needs it more than I do." "That's not how this works. You have no legal obligation." "I'm not talking about legal obligation. I'm talking about moral obligation." The lawyer was quiet. "If you give her this money, it could be used against you. She could argue you're admitting liability, admitting you caused the damage." "Then I'll tell her why I'm giving it to her. I'll write it all down. I'll make a statement. She can use it however she needs to." "That could destroy you in any legal proceeding." "There is no legal proceeding," Marcus said, "and if there is, I deserve to lose." He made arrangements to transfer the money through his lawyer, with a letter explaining his decision. He wrote carefully, "Dear Karen, I am returning the amount of your insurance settlement. You did not deserve to lose your car because I decided to teach you a lesson about boundaries. You deserve the right to make your own mistakes and learn from them without me constructing the circumstances. I am sorry for what I did. I am sorry for the precision of my calculation, for the prediction I made and refused to warn you about, for the trap I let you walk into. I am sorry for the consequences you experienced as a result. I cannot undo any of it, but I can refund the financial impact. Please use this to build whatever you need to in Portland. You deserve a fresh start that's actually fresh, not just geographical. I'm sorry. Marcus Webb." He sent it through his lawyer and waited for something, a response, a thank you, an accusation, a lawsuit. What he got was nothing. Silence. The mail delivery confirmation that showed Karen had received the package, but no words back. 3 months passed without contact from Karen. Marcus continued his therapy sessions. He continued running. He began volunteering at the community center, teaching people how to maintain pools, something he'd become expert at through obsessive dedication to his own. He was teaching a class to a group of teenagers who actually gave a shit about their community when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I don't know what you want from me." It was Karen. His hands went cold. He waited until the class finished before responding. He sat in his car in the parking lot and stared at the message for 5 minutes before typing back. "I don't want anything. I wanted to apologize." The response came quickly. "Why now, 6 months later, after I've lost everything?" He wanted to say it was because he'd processed it in therapy, because he'd understood his own culpability, because he'd done the work of understanding. But that sounded like more narcissism, like he was asking for credit for finally recognizing the harm he'd caused. "Because I owed you it," he wrote. "Not to make myself feel better, to try to actually repair something I broke." There was a long pause, long enough that Marcus thought she might not respond again. Then, "You can't repair it. The money doesn't repair it. You know what broke? Everything, my marriage, my business, my confidence. My dad was dying when I moved to your neighborhood. He died 2 weeks before your gate incident. I was trying to be happy. I was trying to seem fine. I was a wreck underneath and you knew it somehow and you pushed." Marcus felt the words hit him like physical force. Her father was dying, of course. Of course that was why she was defensive and difficult and clinging to performance. She was scared and she'd covered it with aggression. "I didn't know," he wrote. "But you could have asked," she wrote back. "You could have approached me like a human instead of a problem to solve." He couldn't argue with that. He could have knocked on her door early on and asked if everything was okay. Could have said, "I notice you're under stress, can we work this out together?" Could have led with compassion instead of boundaries. "You're right," he wrote. "I'm sorry." Another pause, then, "Did you reinforce that gate on purpose?" This was the moment where he could lie. where he could maintain his legal position, his clean narrative, where he could say no and let her uncertainty remain uncertainty. "I knew what I was doing," he wrote. "Not explicitly, but I predicted enough to justify the action. I knew that if you tried to move your car, the reinforced gate might create problems. I did it anyway." Why would you do that to someone? The question was genuine, not accusatory, genuinely confused about how a person could be that cruel. "Because you weren't listening to me and I couldn't accept that. I needed to make you listen. I needed to be the one in control of the situation, so I set it up so that I would be." "That's psychotic." "Yes," he agreed, "it is." There was no response for an hour. Marcus sat in his car watching the sun descend toward the horizon, thinking about Karen reading his admission, processing it, deciding what it meant about him, about what he'd done, about whether her life being destroyed was somehow acceptable as a teaching tool. Then, "I don't accept your apology." He could feel the finality in those words, the closure she was giving to a narrative that would never make sense to her. "Okay," he wrote, "but I accept the money because I need it, and I needed someone to admit what they did instead of hiding behind legal language, so thank you for that at least." "You're welcome. I hope Portland goes better." "It has to." That was the end of the conversation. Marcus sat in his parked car as the evening grew dark and felt something shift inside him. Not redemption. He didn't deserve redemption, but a kind of release. An acceptance that he'd done something terrible, and that accepting the weight of it was the only thing he could offer. He drove home in the darkness and stood by his pool. The water was still perfect. The gate was still strong. But he'd built them both on foundation of calculated cruelty, and no amount of maintenance would change that. Marcus began the process of selling his house. Not immediately, but over the next 6 months he prepared it. He painted. He repaired. He made it into something someone else could want. The real estate agent was a woman named Patricia, different from his therapist, but with the same quality of seeing people clearly. "Nice place," she said, walking through. "The pool is beautiful, upgraded gate." "Yes. Recent." "About a year ago, there was a situation with a neighbor." Patricia didn't push. She just made a note and continued through the house. When she'd finished the tour, she gave him a realistic price estimate, lower than he'd hoped, higher than he'd feared. "The neighborhood's complicated," she said. "There was an incident with someone's car in your pool. That's on the neighborhood Facebook page. People remember these things. You might have buyers who think the pool's a risk, but you'll find the right person." Marcus found the right person 3 months later. A woman named Dr. Amelia Chen, a cardiologist who wanted the pool for her elderly mother who couldn't handle the impact of regular exercise but could do water therapy. She loved the gate, the security of it. "My mother has dementia," Dr. Chen explained. "She wanders. I need to know she can't leave through the pool area. This gate is perfect." Marcus almost told her the history of the gate, almost explained that it was a monument to someone's calculated cruelty. But that would be burdening her with his guilt, which wasn't fair. Instead, he sold her the house and helped her move in. He even gave her Dr. Patricia Chen's contact information, the therapist, not the realtor, and suggested that if she ever wanted someone to talk to about complicated family dynamics, she was excellent. When he handed over the keys, there was a moment where he stood at the edge of the pool one last time. The water reflected the sky. The gate stood sentinel. And somewhere in Sacramento and now Portland, Karen was building a life that he'd disrupted. 2 years after selling his house, Marcus was living in a small apartment and working as a full-time pool maintenance consultant. Not because he needed to, the divorce settlement had left him financially secure, but because the work was necessary. It kept his hands and mind engaged with something concrete. People needed their pools maintained. It was a simple good. It didn't require calculation. He was at a commercial property, a community center pool, ironically, when he got a call from an unknown number. "Mr. Webb," a woman's voice, familiar but not. "This is Karen Pritchard. I'm using my maiden name now, but you'd know me as Karen." Marcus's chest constricted. "Hi. I'm in the area. Portland didn't work out either. I'm back in California, different city though, Central Coast. And I've been thinking about what you did, the money, the admission, and I wanted to talk to you about it." "Okay," Marcus said carefully. "Not on the phone, in person, if you're willing." He agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in the town where she'd settled. It took him 3 hours to drive there. 3 hours to think about what he might owe her, what words might possibly matter. When he walked into the cafe, he barely recognized her. She looked healthier somehow, lighter. Her hair was different, shorter, less defensive. Her clothes were simpler. She looked like a woman who'd stopped performing and started living. "Hi," she said when he approached. "Hi." They sat across from each other, and Marcus waited for her to speak. He'd learned by now that when you'd wronged someone, you didn't get to control the conversation. "I went to therapy," Karen said without preamble. "A lot of it. After you sent me those flowers, I started thinking about why I was the way I was, why I needed your approval so badly that I violated your boundaries to get it, why I was so defensive that I couldn't just hear a neighbor's request without turning it into a battle. Your father was dying, yes, and I was grieving and I was scared and I was handling it poorly. But that's not an excuse for the things I did. It's a context. There's a difference." Marcus felt something catch in his throat. "I didn't want you to go through all this to make me feel okay about." "You're not listening," Karen said, not unkindly. "I'm not doing this for you, I'm doing it for me, because you broke something in me and I needed to figure out what it was and how to fix it, so I did." "And did you?" "Partially, I'm still working on not performing, not defending, not turning every interaction into a power dynamic. But I'm better. I have a job here. Nothing glamorous, but it's honest. I'm dating someone from my yoga class, not serious yet, but kind. And I've made peace with my father's death instead of just covering it with renovation projects." She reached across the table and put her hand on Marcus's. "I came to tell you that you were right, not about your method, but about the fact that I needed to learn. I needed to understand that my actions had consequences. I just wish you'd taught me that without quite so much precision." Marcus looked at her hand on his. This woman whose life he'd systematically disrupted, who'd gone through months of humiliation and financial loss and social exile, who'd lost her marriage as a consequence of his actions, and she was here telling him she understood. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in ways he hadn't before. "I know, and I'm forgiving you, not because you deserve it, but because I need to move past it." They talked for 2 hours, about her new job, her new life, her therapy process, about Marcus's volunteer work and his own therapy and the way he'd slowly tried to understand what he'd done. When they parted, Karen hugged him, genuinely, and Marcus felt the weight lift slightly. Not disappeared, he would carry this forever, but distributed in a way he could bear. "You should know," she said as they stood in the parking lot, "that the woman who bought your house, Dr. Chen, she's using the pool with her mother, and her mother has improved significantly. Her quality of life is better because of that pool." Marcus nodded. "So your gate, which was built on my car drowning, is now helping someone heal. I wanted you to know that there's something redemptive in there if you need it." Marcus drove home through the Central Coast landscape and thought about the strange way consequences worked. How his cruelty had led to Karen's suffering, which had led to her growth, which meant her experience could inform compassion, which meant she could tell him something that actually mattered. The world was stranger than justice. It was more complicated than fairness. 5 years later, Marcus received an invitation. Karen was getting married. Small ceremony, intimate, just close people. She wanted him there. He almost didn't go, but he thought about who he'd been and who he'd tried to become, and he drove down the coast to the little town where Karen had built her new life. The ceremony was beautiful. The groom was a man named David who looked at Karen like she was still discovering herself, and he was grateful for the privilege of watching it. They'd met in therapy. His therapist had been in the waiting room when Karen arrived for her appointment, and they'd struck up a conversation that became a relationship that became this. Marcus sat in the back and watched Karen become a wife. When the couple walked back down the aisle, she saw him in the congregation and smiled. Not a defensive smile, not a performance, a genuine acknowledgement of a complicated history. At the reception, David came up to him. "You're Marcus," David said, not a question. "I am. Karen told me about what happened. I wanted to tell you that I think you've done real work to make it right. It's not nothing." "It's not enough," Marcus said. "Maybe not, but it's something, and something is where all of us get to start." Later, as the reception was winding down, Karen found him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for inviting me." "I want you to know something," Karen said. "The person I am now, the person who can have a healthy marriage, who can set her own boundaries without needing external validation, who can forgive and move on. I became her partly because of what you did. Because you held up a mirror and showed me that my behavior had real consequences. It broke me to learn it that way, but I needed it broken. You could have learned it kindly, Marcus said. Maybe, but I wouldn't have. I was too defended. I needed something dramatic enough to break through my denial. She hugged him again, and Marcus held onto her briefly, grateful for her ability to transform her trauma into meaning, grateful for her grace, grateful that he'd learned at least something from all of this. When he drove home that night, Marcus thought about the pool gate, about how it had started as a desire to create safety, then become a weapon, then become a monument to learned cruelty, and finally become a tool that someone used to help an elderly woman with dementia access water therapy. The gate itself hadn't changed, but its meaning had. Everything meant something different depending on when and where and why you looked at it. And Marcus had finally learned that lesson, in a way that no amount of therapy or flowers or money could have taught him. The lesson had required watching someone he'd hurt become whole. It had required 5 years of carrying his guilt. It had required the grace of someone choosing forgiveness he didn't deserve. But he'd finally learned it. The world didn't revolve around his boundaries. Other people weren't problems to be solved. Consequences weren't always just, and sometimes the person who suffered most from your actions was capable of more grace than you could comprehend. Marcus was 60 now. His hair was gray. His face had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lot of time in the sun, teaching people about water chemistry and pool maintenance. He received a Christmas card from Karen and David. It had a picture of their 3 children. Apparently things had gone very well for them. There was a note. Dear Marcus, our kids are learning to swim this year. I've taught them about water safety, respect for boundaries, and how sometimes the people we clash with can teach us the most about ourselves. I haven't told them about the car in your pool. That's a story for when they're older. But I wanted you to know that even that disaster became a lesson. I'm grateful for it now, though it took me a long time to get there. We should get coffee when you're in the area. David would like to finally properly meet the man whose gate helped give us a family. Be well. Karen. Marcus framed the card and put it on his desk. He'd never gotten the family. His marriage to Susan had dissolved. He'd had relationships that didn't survive his need to be right, his tendency to calculate rather than connect. But he'd gotten something else. He'd gotten the understanding that cruelty was a choice, that consequences were real, and that redemption, if it existed at all, came through witnessing the people you'd hurt become whole despite you. That was enough. The pool gate, wherever it was now, stood secure against the world. But Marcus had learned that security purchased through prediction and manipulation wasn't security at all. Real safety came from letting people make their mistakes and learn from them. Real boundaries came from kindness, not force. Real peace came from accepting that you couldn't control the outcomes of your actions, only the intentions behind them. He'd learned it the hard way, by installing a gate, by standing in someone's way, by watching their car sink into his pool, by spending 10 years carrying the weight of his own cruelty.